Joel stared at the car parked across his driveway. Its dark silhouette seemed to blend into the shadow of the dim streetlight. This wasn't the first time he'd noticed it. But tonight, something about it made his instincts flare up, sending a chill down his spine. It was late, almost midnight, the time when everything should be quiet, calm, and secure. But here he was, fists clenched, watching the car idle as if it owned his space. A nagging feeling tugged at him, a sense that something was unfolding, something he was about to discover in the worst possible way. As Joel moved closer, the unease in his stomach began to grow, turning into something darker. His thoughts drifted to his wife, Lisa. Her recent behavior had been bothering him. She was always on her phone, disappearing for hours, brushing off his questions with vague replies. And now this. The black sedan parked right at his front door. He took a deep breath, his pulse quickening as he approached the house. His eyes locked on the car. The closer he got, the more it became clear. The person inside had no intention of facing him. Before Joel could reach the car, the driver revved the engine, hesitated just a moment too long, then met his gaze. Fear, maybe guilt, flashed in the driver's eyes before the car sped away into the night. Joel stood in the driveway, fists still clenched, staring at the taillights disappearing down the street. That fleeting, guilty look from the driver was burned into his mind. It was a look he hadn't seen in a long time, a look he never thought would be directed at him, especially by the person sitting next to his wife. As he slowly walked toward the front door, the events of the past few months replayed in his mind. Lisa, once the warm, devoted woman he had shared 20 years with, had changed. It started subtly, a new focus on her appearance, extra hours at the gym with her friend Maria, more nights out than he could keep up with. She had shared old habits, but there was a newfound confidence in her, as if she was shedding her old skin and slipping into something new. At first, Joel admired her transformation, but soon came the distance, the secrets, and then the unmistakable signs of betrayal. Only now, standing in front of his house, did he finally realize he couldn't ignore it any longer. He reached the door, the dim porch light casting shadows across the hallway. Inside, everything was eerily quiet, almost too quiet. His instincts told him Lisa was waiting for him. She had to be. He opened the door, stepping into the dark living room. There she was, standing in the middle of the room, looking at him with wide, nervous eyes, as though caught off guard by his silent entry. Her face was pale, a mixture of defiance and shame written across it. Her arms were tightly folded across her chest, a stance that once would have seemed defensive, but now only revealed her fear. Lisa opened her mouth, as if searching for the right words to explain the car, to explain everything. But Joel spoke first. "Who was in the car, Lisa?" His voice was low but firm, each word heavy with restrained anger. He already knew, but he needed to hear her say it. Lisa's gaze darted toward the window, as if she was considering making a run for it. But she quickly focused back on him. "Joel, it's not what you think," she stammered, her voice cracking. "Not what I think." He let out a bitter laugh. "Do you even hear yourself? That man was parked in front of my house. He took off the moment he saw me. And you're telling me this isn't what I think it is?" She flinched, her face hardening. "I didn't want to start any trouble," she muttered, her voice sharp, but she couldn't meet his eyes. "A friend?" Joel's tone turned colder. "A friend you brought into our home?" Lisa faltered, glancing down, her lips trembling. The truth hovered just beyond her reach. But Joel wasn't waiting for it anymore. His patience had run out. He took a step closer, towering over her. "Why did he run, Lisa? What kind of friend? Can't even look me in the eye." She swallowed, visibly shaken. For a second, Joel saw a flicker of the woman he once knew, the woman who would never betray him, the woman who used to hold his hand in this very room, laughing and promising him forever. But that woman was gone, replaced by a stranger clinging to lies. "He was just here to talk," she muttered, barely audible. "Talk!" Joel's voice boomed, his anger now beyond control. He ran Lisa. Just like you're running now. Look at you. You can't even admit what's been going on. Lisa opened her mouth, but no words came out. She just stood there, shrinking under his accusing gaze. Joel felt the last threads of his patience snap. It was over. Whatever love, loyalty, or trust they had built over the years had crumbled in this one moment, crushed under the weight of her betrayal. With one last look, he took a deep breath and stepped back. Joel stood there, looking at Lisa with a mixture of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. He could feel the rage rising inside him, pushing him to do something, anything, to make sense of the whirlwind he had been dragged into. But then he remembered the taunt from earlier that day, the mocking words of the man he now recognized as the driver of that car. Your friend was so bold over the phone, wasn't he? Joel's voice was a low growl as he paced around the room, trying to control the fury coursing through him, talking about how he'd handle me, how he'd show me what a real man looked like. He turned to Lisa, his eyes hard and unyielding. But one look at me, and he couldn't even face what he'd done. Or maybe he just couldn't face what you both have done. Lisa's face drained of color. She had tried to keep up the facade, but now she looked trapped. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Joel, she finally managed. It's not what you think. He was just upset. He didn't mean any of that. I didn't mean any of this. Joel's voice was barely a whisper, but the anger in it was undeniable. Then tell me, Lisa, what did you mean by humiliating me in front of your friends? Or boasting about this coward of a man? Did you think I wouldn't find out? Tears welled in her eyes as she struggled to find the words. But Joel wasn't done. You were so eager to flaunt this, to humiliate me, and now where is he? His laughter was bitter, cutting through the silence. Some champion you chose. Look where he left you. Lisa's shoulders sagged. Her mouth opened and closed as she tried to defend herself. But there was no defense for what she had done. She knew it. The fight had gone out of her, replaced by the dawning fear of what was about to happen. Finally, she whispered, I'm sorry, Joel. I never wanted it to go this far. He shook his head. He didn't want it to go this far. His voice was incredulous, his eyes piercing into hers with raw fury. But here we are because of your choices, Lisa. You shattered everything we built. She tried to take a step toward him, reaching out a trembling hand. But Joel pulled back. The distance between them felt like a chasm. He could see her remorse now, flickering, but it was too little, too late. Even as she looked up at him, silently pleading, all he could feel was a growing emptiness inside. Tell me, Lisa, Joel demanded, his voice quiet but laced with ice. Was it worth it? The thrill? The secrecy? The so-called excitement? Was it worth destroying our family? Lisa crumbled under his gaze, finally covering her face with her hands. The sobs she'd been holding back broke free. Joel watched her cry, but he felt no urge to comfort her, no impulse to ease her pain. Instead, he felt only the raw weight of betrayal pressing down on him, anchoring him in place. After a long silence, Joel looked around the room. Their photos on the wall, the worn couch where they'd spent countless evenings together, the shelves lined with mementos of a life that now felt like a lie. His home, his sanctuary, no longer felt like his. It felt tarnished, like everything he had built had been tainted by her deceit. Finally, he turned back to Lisa. His voice was steady but exhausted. I can't do this. Lisa, I can't keep living a life built on lies, he said, the words hanging heavily in the air. Her sobs stopped abruptly, and she looked up, fear flashing in her eyes. Joel, please, we can work through this. I made a mistake, but don't throw everything away. But his mind was made up. The betrayal was a wound too deep to heal. As much as he wished he could rewind time, he knew he couldn't undo what had been done. He had seen the truth now, the ugly reality she had tried to hide. There was no going back. Without another word, he walked to the door. Each step felt heavier than the last. He opened it, pausing just once to look back at her. She was standing there, broken, pleading, but he felt nothing. Whatever they'd had was gone, shattered beyond repair. With that, he closed the door behind him and stepped into the night, ready to face whatever came next alone. As Joel walked into the cool night air, he felt a mix of relief and a deep ache that settled heavily in his chest. He had left Lisa there, alone in their home, which now felt like a stranger's. The quiet street seemed surreal, each familiar feature of his neighborhood cast in a new light. He had spent years building this life, investing in every little detail that had once symbolized security and happiness. Now it was like standing outside a house of cards that had collapsed, wondering if it was worth ever building anything again. He sat down on the front steps, trying to process the maelstrom inside him. The betrayal hurt, of course, but it was a humiliation. The very public way Lisa had flaunted her lover, that stung the most. She had invited him into their lives, taunted Joel with the supposed superiority of this other man, only for it to crumble under a single look. The irony was bitter and cutting. Joel clenched his fists, feeling a cold fury he had never felt before. He looked down the street, his eyes tracing the path where the lover's car had disappeared, tires squealing as it sped off. He couldn't shake the memory of the man's cowardice, his pale, frightened face barely visible through the windshield before he fled. All those bravado-filled threats, the sneering taunts over the phone. Empty words from a man who couldn't even hold his ground. A sick satisfaction welled up in Joel at the thought that the man had been too afraid to face him. He wasn't sure how long he sat there, his mind replaying each moment of the night, dissecting it piece by piece, examining every painful detail. He thought of the years he'd invested in this marriage, the countless sacrifices he'd made to ensure Lisa and the kids had everything they needed. He had weathered hard times with her, stood by her side through her battles, her insecurities, even that grueling fight with cancer 7 years ago. He had been her rock. He had thought that counted for something, that their bond was unbreakable. Now, he realized that somehow that wasn't enough. Suddenly, his phone buzzed, snapping him out of his trance. He pulled it from his pocket and saw a message from his old friend Mike. "Hey, man, I know it's late, but you good? Heard from Jake that things were rough at home. Let me know if you want to talk." Joel stared at the message, feeling an overwhelming urge to talk, to get everything off his chest. He hadn't reached out to anyone about what he'd been dealing with, partly out of shame, partly because he'd still been hoping it would all blow over. But that hope was gone, replaced by a hollow ache he didn't know how to fill. He typed a quick reply. "Not sure what there is to say, Mike. Everything's blown up." A moment later, his phone buzzed again. "I'm here, man. Whatever you need. You don't have to go through this alone." Joel let out a long breath. He didn't feel like talking about it. Not yet. But it felt strangely comforting to know someone was there. That maybe, just maybe, there was still a flicker of support in his life that hadn't been tainted by betrayal. He typed back a simple thanks and pocketed his phone again. As he sat there in the quiet, staring up at the stars, barely visible through the city lights, he felt something shift inside him. This wasn't the life he had wanted. But maybe this was the push he needed to finally reclaim some part of himself. He had lived so much of his life for others, Lisa, the kids, the family they'd built. But now, for the first time, he wondered what it might be like to live for himself, to rebuild on his own terms. The thought was terrifying, but also strangely freeing. Joel rose to his feet, feeling a weight lift slightly from his shoulders. He took one last look at the house, their house, now reduced to a shell of broken promises, and turned his back on it. Joel walked away from the house, his footsteps crunching on the gravel as he made his way toward his car. The night was quiet, heavy with the finality of his decision. With each step, he felt the painful but liberating realization that the life he'd known was over. The love he had once shared with Lisa, built up over 2 decades of commitment, had been poisoned beyond repair. She had made her choice, and now he was making his. Sitting behind the wheel, Joel took a moment to steady his breathing. The ache of betrayal still cut deeply. But as he looked back at the house one last time, he realized he didn't feel regret. He had done everything he could, given her everything he had, and she had thrown it away. There was no turning back from the bitterness that had festered between them. He switched on the ignition, letting the low hum of the engine fill the silence. For a moment, he just sat there, unsure where he would go. He didn't want to be at home, nor did he want to go to some empty hotel room that would only remind him of his solitude. Then he thought about Mike's message, the way it had cut through his isolation like a lifeline. With a sense of purpose, Joel sent Mike a quick message. "Mind if I swing by? Might take you up on that talk after all." The response was immediate. "Absolutely. Come over. I'll put on some coffee." Joel drove through the night, the winding road around him as he made his way through familiar streets. A wave of memories washed over him as he passed landmarks from his life with Lisa. The grocery store where they'd spent Saturday mornings, the park where they'd taken the kids on weekends, the old diner where they'd celebrated anniversaries with pie and coffee. But tonight, these places no longer felt like they belonged to him. They were remnants of a life he was leaving behind, symbols of a love that had turned hollow and bitter. He pulled into Mike's driveway, his heart heavy but resolute. Mike met him at the door, his face lined with concern, but without a trace of pity, something Joel was grateful for. The two men embraced in a quick, reassuring hug, and Mike led him inside. The warmth and familiarity of Mike's living room, with its worn leather couches and stacks of old magazines, felt like a sanctuary compared to the cold emptiness Joel had left behind. "Coffee or something stronger?" Mike asked, his voice calm and steady. Joel hesitated, then gave a slight nod. "Something stronger." Mike poured 2 glasses of bourbon and handed one to Joel. They sat in silence for a moment, the quiet stretching out comfortably between them. Joel finally broke the silence, his voice low and hoarse. "It's over, Mike. 20 years. And she just threw it all away." Mike nodded, letting Joel's words hang in the air before replying. "I'm sorry, man. I know how much you loved her. You didn't deserve this." Joel's jaw tightened. "I keep asking myself where I went wrong, if there was something I missed, or if I could have been better somehow. But the truth is, it wasn't enough for her. I wasn't enough." Mike put a hand on Joel's shoulder, a solid, grounding presence in the midst of his turmoil. "Don't do that to yourself, Joel. This isn't on you. She made her choices, and she'll have to live with them. But you have a chance to start over, to build something better for yourself." Joel stared into his glass, the amber liquid reflecting the dim light in the room. "Starting over." The words tasted foreign, but also held a glimmer of possibility. "It feels like I'm standing on the edge of a cliff," Joel admitted. "Yeah," Mike replied, leaning back. "But think about it. Everything that held you back, everything that limited you, it's behind you now. You can do whatever you want. Go wherever you want. You don't have to keep living in the shadow of what you thought your life was supposed to be." Joel considered this, letting the idea settle into him. He had spent so long defining himself by his role as a husband, a father, a provider. But now he was free to rebuild, to reclaim the parts of himself he had sacrificed over the years. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight in his chest ease just a little. "It's terrifying," he admitted, "but maybe you're right. Maybe it's time I finally start thinking about what I want." Mike raised his glass, a spark of encouragement in his eyes. "To new beginnings." Joel clinked his glass against Mike's, the sound like a small but powerful promise to himself. The road ahead would be long, filled with pain and uncertainty. But for the first time in months, Joel felt the tiniest flicker of hope. The journey had just begun,